I'm an American Armenian, representing both nations in the media. And can you hear the sound of hysteria? The subliminal mind-blown America. Alright! Welcome to a new kind of tension all across the alien nations. Everything isn't meant to be okay. Television dreams of tomorrow. We're not the ones who meant to follow. For all that's enough to argue.
Welcome to a brand new episode of the American Armenian. Today joining me are a pair of attorneys, Harry Kaladjian and Joseph Kazazian. How you doing, gentlemen?
We're doing great, Gabriel. Thank you for inviting us.
Gabe, good seeing you, brother.
Harry, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, well, I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for over 22 years. I'm originally from Africa. I've lived in LA most of my life, studied here, went to public schools in Los Angeles. I grew up in LA and went to law school in LA and practiced in LA for the entirety of my career. And I've been focusing on a lot of international law issues relating to Armenians and Armenia ever since I was a teenager. And I honed in on it in law school when I took an international criminal law class one summer semester. And during that time, I was an editor for an international law journal. And when the professors found out that I was Canadian and had lived in Quebec, in 1998, it turns out that the Canadian Supreme Court issued an advisory opinion on the constitutionality and legality of the secession of the province of Quebec from Canada. And they asked me to do a case note on it. And when I did, I was thinking, of course, well, all these rules apply to Artsakh. And so there was some articles written at the time about the legality of what they call the Nagorno-Karabakh as an independent state to secede under remedial secession. I wrote about it at the time. I was asked to write about it, for Quebec anyway. Interestingly, the Canadian Supreme Court opinion, they were asked three questions, one of which was whether under international law, Quebec has a right to secede. So it was interesting. You've got the Canadian Supreme Court basically giving us an outline of the criteria where people, let's say, are entitled to secede. And basically you look at whether these people are under threat of annihilation. In the case of Quebec, they didn't even cover annihilation. It was just a matter of feeling discriminated against, whether their culture, their French language isn't being respected as a co-equal language. And that for themselves would have been enough to secede out of Canada, let alone getting beheaded by the crazy lunatics that are our neighbors. And so I always go back to this opinion. See, it's interesting. It's an advisory opinion, probably. Maybe it's a flaw in the Canadian Constitution where they actually allow advisory opinions, whereas the American Constitution doesn't allow. They actually require case and controversies. But it's always something that I refer to and throw back at their faces now. If the Canadian government takes a position, or a Canadian Parliament member takes a position that is against Armenians' rights, I always remind them about this advisory opinion. And I say, well, you yourself hold under Canadian or under international law. Armenians are entitled to self-determination. They're entitled to secede because they're facing an existential threat, let alone language discrimination or not being treated equally. Anyway, so that has always sat in the back of my mind. And I've always thought this issue should be pushed constantly. And we have to be using the words, the right to self-determination of the people of Artsakh. And under the United Nations conventions, it's embodied in their charter. All people have a right to self-determination, right? No one has any right to rule over anybody else. And so in the case of people living under the domination of some other party, well, you say, are they entitled to internal self-determination or external self-determination? If they're not being discriminated against, why would there be a need to secede, right? There would never be a need to secede. They're being treated as co-equals. In the case of the French in Canada, I remember because I was living in Quebec at the time, in 1982, they amended their they drafted a new constitution. They made French a co-equal language, and they pointed out to all the accomplishments of the French Canadians. The prime minister was French, Pierre Trudeau. The officials were French. Quebec had the largest economy. There was no reason for the French to be entitled to secede. And so this set a precedent for them. Because if you remember at the time, the French Quebecois were constantly pushing referendums. They were voting on whether they should secede. So this was always in the psyche of the Canadians as a whole. What do we do if the French actually passed a vote and decided to secede? And so the Canadian Supreme Court issued an opinion saying, well, you haven't met the criteria to secede. Well, as Armenians, we look at that opinion and say, well, how do we use this in the situation of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh? And so clearly, the Armenians have a right to secede, not only per the constitution of the Soviet Union, but because they are a people who are under danger of annihilation. And we have precedent under Kosovo in the late 90s or mid 90s. And I keep saying this was Bill Clinton's mistake when he allowed the severance of Kosovo from Serbia. Because ever since then, the Russians constantly and continuously point to that as establishing that right to independence. So why does the Western world allow it for their interests, but they don't allow it for other interests? And setting that aside, the Armenian experience predates all of this. Remember, the Armenian movement for, let's say, attaching Nagorno-Karabakh to the Armenian Soviet Republic started off in 1988. I was a teenager at the time, and as a kid of the 80s, going through the Cold War and watching Gorbachev take the helm of the Soviet Union and instituting this glasnost perestroika programs, the first people who actually demonstrated were the Armenians of the Soviet Union. And when Americans saw this, they thought, well, this is an opportunity to cause internal instability, let's say, for the Soviet Union. So they passed resolutions calling for the Armenians to have self-determination. They were pro-Armenia at the time. And perhaps things would have been different, but since independence and oil interests kicked in, and now we have these huge lobby groups and their interests, it has shifted somewhat to be anti-Armenian. Set aside these financial interests. What are these people going to do? They're facing an existential threat by these lunatics. I mean, the official stamp of Azerbaijan calls for the chemical cleansing of lands where Armenians live. If this happened to anybody, if this happened to Jews or any group, the United States would have sanctioned them the next day. Yet we are supposed to tolerate this. I mean, we had the former ambassadors, American ambassadors to Armenia, tell us at a Zoom event during COVID, well, these are your neighbors. You just have to get used to them. I mean, we all want peace. But when we're dealing with lunatics who are calling for now, and you've heard officials in Turkey calling for the completion of the Armenian genocide, that the Armenia can be wiped off the map, the geography can change. What are we dealing with here? Why aren't we advocating more of this? So, and this goes back to the genocide, the fact that it remains an unresolved crime, the fact that the Turks were able to get away with it and now whitewash it as though it's a disputed event that we really don't know what happened. Let's just let historians talk about it. That's what they say to the Europeans, but to us, they say we're going to commit and continue with the genocide. So I find it as, for me, all four of my grandparents are orphans from the genocide. The reason I was born in Africa is because my grandfather found refuge as an orphan. And so for us, it's an unresolved crime that we will not let go. I mean, regardless of what the Republic of Armenia does, the diaspora's voice has to be heard. And as an attorney, as an advocate, as a lobbyist, as maybe, I don't want to call myself a human rights individual, but at some point we have to address this unresolved crime. Because look at the rhetoric coming out of Turkey. They openly talk about completing a genocide. So how do we, in the diaspora, unite with a common agenda against this violent Turkic threat? What do we do? And so this weekend, there was an event, the annual gala by the ANC Western Region.
Before we go into that, let me introduce our other guest, Joseph Kazazian. Joe, can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. I'm Joe Kazazian, also an attorney, and it's an honor to obviously follow Mr. Kaladjian after all this. I mean, he is essentially, I'm sitting here taking notes as this is happening because it's quite an honor. It's quite an honor. And, activists, especially Armenian activists, were all cut from very similar cloths. Like we're, a collective experience, both as individuals living in the United States, now as attorneys, activists, lobbyists, what have you. But, a lot of things that Harry touched on, it's just, one building block after the other. A little bit about me. Like I said, I'm an attorney, longtime activist. I've been in the halls of Congress. I've been in the halls of the state capitol, local government, elections, doing shows like this, podcasts, trying to educate people as much as I can to the best of my abilities. On top of that, I just, I love to talk. I'm a travel attorney at the end of the day. So I make the most of it. Look, Harry touched on so many wonderful things. And, a lot of it is, number one thing he mentioned, he brought up the example of Kosovo. So there's a concept in law that we have of what we call remedial succession, which is, something we've talked about with Artsakh that, is a remedy to various human rights violations, to specifically ethnic cleansing, things of that nature, things we've seen very recently over the course of the last few years. We are now, today is actually the second anniversary of the war. And Gabe, you remember, we did a podcast together at the height of it. Of course, we've had a lot of lessons since then and so many that haven't been learned, but, not to take away too much from anybody else's time, really, the crux is that right now, when you talk about the statehood of Armenia specifically, it's at a existential threat, right? Because Armenia's, the way they talk about it, like, they're an ally of Russia and they're this and they're that. And, all of a sudden you have Nancy Pelosi showing up at our doorstep and we're kind of sitting here as Armenians like, well, where the hell have you been this entire time? Like, we've been screaming bloody murder. That's one issue. The other thing is, Azerbaijan is now on Armenia proper, in addition to, carving out large swaths of Artsakh. So we sit at a very, very interesting crossroads, not only as a people, but as far as advocacy is concerned, as far as activism is concerned, as far as, even the practice of law and the profession of law is concerned. My main thing is, I'm not an international law expert. I'm very much grassroots. I've become one of those guys that goes to the halls of Congress, knocks on a congressman's door, and pleads their case. I tried to influence as much as I can, or have in the past tried to influence as much as I can through the legislature, helping to pass resolutions. I was a part of the ANCA Western Regions Government Affairs Committee for many, many years. Got a lot of my experience with activism and advocacy, what have you, through those channels. And most of them are just, the regular guys like me. There is no giant, massive, real Armenian lobby. I mean, we are literally exactly who we are. We walk in, we plead our case, and hopefully if we find someone who's willing to listen, we get things done. So yeah, that's pretty much me. And my background, of course, yeah, I'm a lawyer. It's what I do. I talk for a living. So that's the fun of what I do.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Harry, why don't you give us a recap of your weekend?
My week. I'll give you the recap of the weekend event.
Yeah.
So I'm not politically affiliated with any organization. I just advocate on Armenian cause issues, and I help anybody who wants my help. I want to say that first. So for those who don't know, ANCA is a grassroots organization that dates back about 100 years, and it focuses and champions those causes affecting Americans of Armenian descent. And so this weekend, they had their annual gala, which was preceded by a seminar series, I suppose, on Saturday. That was initially, the first one was called The Prevention of Cultural Genocide. There was Dr. Lernik Hovanesyan, Dr. Mashinka Hagopian, and which was moderated by Simon Marakian. I know Simon is on social media, and everybody here should follow him, because he is the foremost, I would say, expert on the cultural cleansing that occurred in Nakhichevan. He is featured prominently in numerous periodicals, and people describe him as relentless when it comes to Armenian cultural preservation. He is a reference guide for everyone regarding cultural genocide, basically. And Dr. Lernik Hovanesyan, he is the Deputy Minister of Culture and Youth of Artsakh, and he has kept an archive of all the desecrations and erasures that has been occurring in Artsakh. He's a native of Karintak, which apparently now falls under Azeri occupation. And so he has a personal attachment with these issues. And Dr. Mashinka Hagopian is a social media whiz. She's a professor and helps broadcast and bring attention to Armenian cause issues. So this was our morning event. And we had a luncheon event featuring Dr. David Babayan, the foreign minister of Artsakh. And his message was basically of one of unity. We have to be united as Armenians and speak with a common agenda, common cause. And then, of course, Professor Arman Tatoyan was also present. He was the former human rights ombudsman for Armenia, the human rights defender, and he documented with maps the Azeri incursions into Armenia, and he's reflecting this back to international organizations. And so all of them were wonderful, capable people. It was terrific to be a part of. And then the afternoon event covered the attorneys who handled the ICJ case that was brought against the Republic of Azerbaijan. It was spearheaded by Dr. Yerisha Giragosyan, who represents Armenia, and his assistant Levon Gevorkian, and of course Kary Kerkonian, who's an attorney, an international attorney based in Chicago. So, and this was moderated by Garo Ghazarian. And so they covered this, the filing against Azerbaijan, the ruling, and their next steps. interestingly, at a question and answer session, um, I should say sadly, I asked whether, because I remember back going 22 years, I suppose, when I was studying the International Criminal Court. And my professor at the time, our final exam question, it still reverberates to me to this day. He said, "Is it of any consequence having these rulings or these courts?" And I remember one of my answers was, as long as you're aligned with the Security Council member to the United Nations, no proceeding can be held. They could just delay things forever. So, do we really have justice in an international arena? Probably not. Do the ICJ rulings have any teeth? There's no enforcement mechanism, but it has a diplomatic aspect to it. Does a country want to be labeled as genocidal? And how does that echo back to social circles? And it's our job, and I say this with every Armenian. See, the problem with the Armenian community is that we are not maybe aware of the legalities or what's going on. We need to be aware of these issues so that if F1 decides to have their Formula One race in Baku, we can reach out to their sponsors and say, are you aware of the ICJ rulings? Are you aware of this national stamp of Azerbaijan calling for the genocide of the Armenian population? Are you aware that Armenophobia is rampant, or Armenians are not allowed in Azerbaijan? They're considered dogs and animals who should be killed. Or that the army patch of Azerbaijan basically says, Armenian, you may run, but you're going to die anyway. So it's up to us to bring this to their attention. And, frankly, Armenians are not even aware of this, let alone foreigners. We have to be aware, have an agenda, and relate this back to people. I used to think that maybe there was some evil that these people didn't care. And I'm giving them, and because maybe they just care more about oil, but I'm thinking I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm just going to, for now, consider this plain ignorance. And I'm going to blame myself for not educating these people. So my goal is to go after these people and to make them aware of what they're aligning themselves with. Armenia, for the first time in my life, and my parents have never been to Armenia, for the first time I went to Armenia this June. Armenia is an open, peaceful, fun-loving society that focuses on education, history, the arts, culture. We're not a genocidal country that looks at expanding from Europe to Central Asia, which is what the Turks want. So, and I met a lot of foreigners in Armenia who said to me, this is like a hidden gem for us. We didn't know what Armenia was like. And some of them decided to stay there because they just loved living there. It was just a great place to live. And I was actually kind of emboldened to maybe make that move myself. So perhaps it's our fault that we're not educating the public about what this regime in Azerbaijan is. Really? A genocidal regime? Really? They are. It's not even, they're explicitly genocidal. They don't even hide it. So maybe it's our fault collectively as a community. We need to be talking in a common voice and alerting our representatives. It's interesting. Before the gala took place on Sunday, I was shocked to see Congresswoman Spear and Adam Schiff walking around. I thought they would be, surrounded by all these security people. And so I went up to Congresswoman Spear and I spoke to her. And I spoke with Adam Schiff openly. And I said, for those who don't know, I filed this lawsuit against the executive branch here for waiving 907 in violation of the United States Constitution and existing laws. I wanted to introduce myself and tell them about this case. And it was an interesting dialogue because at first they were shocked, but Congresswoman Spear, who unfortunately is apparently retiring this year, she said, but we're not giving aid anymore to Azerbaijan. It's not going to happen next year. I said, well, what guarantees do we have that it's being stopped? And quite frankly, why didn't the president just follow the law? The waiver of Section 907 requires a reporting of how these funds are being used by Azerbaijan. And there's no reporting by the State Department or the executive branch. So basically, the argument is that they're violating American laws. And that is tantamount to Armenophobia. They themselves warn Americans, such as myself, of Armenian ancestry, that Azerbaijan practices Armenophobia. You cannot travel to Azerbaijan if you have an IAN in your last name. So why am I tolerating this as an American? Why are my tax dollars funding Armenophobia against me? And so my lawsuit was based on the executive branch's violation of existing laws, and that is tantamount to Armenophobia in violation of the United States Constitution. Anyway, so just things that we are doing we all have to think about. But number one is advocacy. Number one is education. Number two is advocacy. And we have to do it on a daily basis. Like the gala was inspiring. It was one day. What do we do the next day and the day after and the day after? I've been advocating to every Armenian that I meet. I say, are you aware of your congressional leaders, their identities, their telephone numbers, their emails? The ANCA has this wonderful program called Rapid Responder. You could go on their website and sign up and be a rapid responder, and they will do the work for you. They will send emails, they will make the calls or whatever. But honestly, you also have to do this individually. I found out in my district, they know me now. They know, number one, I'm an attorney, and I've held my congressman accountable. I said, how come you're not talking about being a co-sponsor to the genocide resolution or punishing Azerbaijan and what? And eventually his assistants got back to me. So you have to pick up the phone and call these people up. And I understand people might be a little apprehensive, but ANCA does a great job of delineating the points that you need to know and how to express yourself. So look at their rapid responder program. They'll email it to you, read it, memorize it, pick up the phone and do the same thing. If each one look, there are 1 million Armenians living in the United States. This is the power of the diaspora. The Turks call us the toxic diaspora for a reason, right? Well, how toxic are we if we're not making the effort? Regardless of what happens in the Republic of Armenia, I'm not an Armenian citizen. I can't speak on behalf of the Armenian citizen on the streets of Yerevan. I don't live there. I don't work there. I don't pay taxes there. And my children or I am not exposed to violence there. They don't serve in the army. Yes, my heart bleeds here. I'm suffering for the last 2 years. I said 30 years since '88. Constantly, this issue hasn't gone away. But at the very least, what can I do here as an American that my taxes don't support Armenophobia? My taxes don't support genocidal Turkey. At least I have a say here in what happens in the United States. I might not have a say in what Nikol Pashinyan does and what my step faction do, but at the very least, I can, and frankly, and this is another point I want to raise. When this whole war took out or started, and there was a ceasefire statement, I won't name this individual, but an official said to me, "Well, don't you think it's a good idea to open up the borders for trade?" I said, "Well, I can't speak what you might do because it involves you. But also remember, you don't speak on behalf of the diaspora. The Republic of Armenia has no right to talk about the Armenian genocide. I'm not an Armenian citizen. I'm a descendant of survivors, and you have no right to talk about the Armenian genocide to the Republic of Turkey." So it goes both ways. So it's sad that we've come to this. I would have preferred a united front with the Republic of Armenia, but it looks like the Turks, and their goal has always been to divide the country with the diaspora, leave the toxic diaspora out of the conversation. Well, there's 1 million toxic Armenians living in the United States. Turkey should not be getting any penny from me or any of us. And that's something we need to work on. I don't know. So the gala included people like Senator Schiff, Congresswoman Spear, I should say Congressman Schiff, and it awarded certain recipients for their work in the community to bring awareness to Armenian cause issues. There was an announcement by Dr. Israelian that, Kim Kardashian, regardless of what you may think, she is such an advocate. She donated $1 million for this event. And they basically said this was the biggest donation in their history. So she does educate herself. She made a video presentation. I was very impressed with her words. She does educate herself on issues really affecting Armenians. And she has a great following, and she's a great voice for our collective voices to be heard. And there were other important individuals as well. It was a very, very emotional event. And I encourage everybody to just engage and participate and follow. All of us have access to social media, right? All of us can follow the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan and the U.S. Embassy in Baku and the U.S. Embassy in Ankara on social media platforms. We just don't follow ourselves. We also have to follow these genocidal lunatics to see what they're thinking, what they're planning, what they're conspiring, which is what they are doing, actually. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, if you want to talk about the recent delegation visit by Pelosi, Spear, Eshu, and Frank Pallone to Armenia, I'll talk about that. Apparently, some information was relayed today about what was discussed in Armenia about selling American military equipment to Armenia, and the statements made about how they're limited or what they can sell, and what they really want from Armenia. And Armenia has to walk this fine, delicate line, considering maybe the perceived weakness of Russia right now. If Russia is weak, the Turks make their move, and that's what we're seeing. So who's stepping up to protect Armenia? So these are all issues we have to be mindful of and be careful, because the slightest mistake, I've been saying this for the longest time, 30 years, I don't know how old you guys are, but 30 years ago in 1994, when the ceasefire agreement happened, and people say they don't have a historical understanding of why was there a ceasefire. I remember the ceasefire and why it happened in 94. When the Armenians of Artsakh took over Karabajan, Turkey put in 300,000 troops on the Armenian border. And Turgut Özal said, we're going to remind Armenians of 1915 again. And Russia made a statement at the time and alerted the US State Department. Russia said, if you invade Armenia, this will be the start of World War III. And told the Armenians, stop wherever you are. That's why we had the ceasefire in 1994. I hear, individuals, young kids saying, why did we stop? Why was there a ceasefire? We sold the lands in 94. Really, in reality, what happened was Russia said, stop wherever you are. Turkey's about to invade. World War III is about to happen. And then the West engaged to this negotiating process. And the OSCE Minsk group was formed to talk about resolution. How do we resolve Nagorno-Karabakh? This is what happened. And now we see it again. That 17-mile stretch of Syunik, I think it's 17 miles, may cause World War III. People don't realize this and think it's like a joke or something. Because if you recall in 2020 during the war, all of these neoconservatives are going on social media, including Jewish groups, saying how if Armenia is eliminated and the Turks unite, this ultimately will cause the collapse of Iran, Russia, and China. Can you believe this? The 17-mile width of Armenia, as little as we are, and they've stolen basically everything from us, the little that we have left is still being eyed by world powers, and it might cause World War III and cause this whole chain of collapse. So I always have to go back to this of, well, what serves Armenia's interests? What serves the Iranian interests? And perhaps this is the reason why the Iranians constantly talk about, we will not tolerate any changes to our geography. This route has been available to us for thousands of years. And they have now amassed 45,000 troops on the border of Armenia in that Nakhichevan area. And it's a threat to the Turks not to invade. So I follow these things and I'm thinking, okay, what's going to happen? How do I advocate here? Some of the things that we have to think about also as advocates, not only our tax dollars, but why is Turkish Airlines allowed to fly into the United States? Turkish Airlines is owned by the Republic of Turkey. And the US State Department in 2020 during the war noted openly that Turkey is using Turkish Airlines to fly in terrorists, mercenaries from Syria. So is Turkey using this airlines for terrorism? How the hell is this are they allowed to fly into the United States? The Jews were able to ban Middle East airlines from flying into the United States. MEA, which is the national carrier of Lebanon in the 80s and 90s. To this day, MEA doesn't fly into the United States because of that legislation. Why is Turkish Airlines allowed to fly into the United States? Number one. Why is Grey Wolves not declared an international terrorist organization? The Grey Wolves were apparently hunting down Armenians in Europe. France banned them. Germany, I think, or the European Union banned them. How come we're not doing that here in the United States? So there are things we can do. We're not hopeless, powerless people. There are a million of us. So if we have this agenda, a common agenda, we can do a lot of things. So just some of the things I was thinking about, and I did approach Congresswoman Spear, and I'm sure you heard today or yesterday was that she introduced legislation condemning Azerbaijan, which I don't know, what the hell does that even mean? Nothing. But it's better than nothing, I suppose. I take that back. It's something. And she also made a statement that America is willing to sell arms to Armenia, but they're worried that it might fall under Russian control And so Armenia has to make a decision, like Ukraine, to kick out Russia maybe out of the region. I mean, is this what was offered behind closed doors to Pashinyan? We will sell you aid, but kick Russia out, be out of CSTO? Like, what kind of guarantee is that? And do we want a future like Ukraine and Armenia? Or do the Iranians want? I mean, there's just so many issues here, and Armenia is just stuck there. But what was touching was the emotional attachment that Jackie Spear conveyed to us. You know, she's half Armenian.
Oh.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she's retiring now, but she's half Armenian. She talked about her upbringing when she was a little girl. She didn't know where she fit in society because she said you could not find the word Armenia on a map. And so when she went to Armenia, she overheard this woman cry out to her, and people were parading with American flags, greeting them with such love. She said, a woman said to her, "Save Armenia. Please save Armenia." And so she started crying when she was recounting this to us. So the American government knows, really, the Turkic genocidal policies, but what can they do? Maybe that was the reason why Biden recognized the genocide in 2021, I believe. But even that I find questionable, and I highlighted that as part of my lawsuit. And I said this to Jackie Spear, by the way. I said, I find it interesting, I said, that on April 23, he waived Section 907, didn't publicize it, had a conversation with Erdogan on April 23. On April 24th, came out, made this public speech about recognizing the genocide. And then the waiver issue was publicized in May. Why did they wait 2-3 weeks to publicize it? And Armenians just thought that it just had occurred in May. And so when I was thinking about my lawsuit, April was approaching, and the waiver has to be signed on a yearly basis. It has to be done every year. I thought, oh my God, April is coming. He's going to waive it again, and he's going to keep it a secret again, like he did last year. Sure enough, I filed my lawsuit, requested a restraining order. It got dismissed, and they waited 60 days. Now, I'd like to take credit for this, even though I can't confirm it. They waited 60 days thinking that my appeal would have been up and my deadline would have passed. Right after the 60th day deadline, he files the waiver again. He signs the waiver again. So I went back and I looked at the docket and I saw some technical mistakes by the federal court and how they actually docketed the dismissal. And I said, wait a minute, I don't have 60 days. I've got 150 days to do my appeal. And I was going to do it anyway, but I was just in Armenia when I had heard about this waiver issue in June. So I got back and I filed the appeal. And of course, the first thing the U.S. Attorney for the Department of Justice says to me is, "You're past your deadline. You can't do your appeal." I said, "No, there's a technical flaw here. I've got 150 days. And he goes, "Okay, well, send me the law on that." I sent it to him. And then yesterday I got served with a motion to dismiss the appeal without hearing. And so now I've been researching on that, and I have to work on that. I don't know what's going to happen. It's a very difficult process. It's a very politicized issue. I don't know how the courts are interpreting this, because it's a case of first impression, really. The justiciability issues that I've raised, it has never been raised before, about standing, really, as a taxpayer, where the executive branch violates the law. There is no precedent for this. And so I said, if this doesn't work out, might as well just take it to the Supreme Court. Let's see if they will take this up and hear it. Wouldn't that be something?
I mean, I'm gonna chime in here, and I mean, I mean, this is. I'm not kidding. I've been taking pages upon pages of notes because I'm the young shark in the tank, if you will. I am the baby attorney here, compared to your very obvious expertise. You raised so many interesting questions, especially when it came to obviously the legalese of it. At the end of the day, before you're a lawyer, you're a legal scholar, and that never stops. That scholarship always creating issues. And it's so funny because there's issues of you talk about ripeness or mootness, you talk about justiciability, and those are all things we start learning from our first day in law school and use it all the way through our practice, and it never stops, right? Your timeliness of your appeal, whether it's 60 days, 150 days, and plus you're talking about the wrangling of federal court. Now, in my business, we call them AUSAs, assistant U.S. attorneys. In criminal defense, we call them a useless attorney because a lot of times it's defense counsel or plaintiff's counsel, especially when they're on the respondent side, that's really doing the homework for them, saying, well, this is what the law says. It's like, no, we're going to chew it up, put it in your mouth so you can do your job, right? I mean, as a former, quasi-government attorney, I was a public defender for a while there. So I know, what the burden is, like, trying to take on the juggernaut. And I hope you don't mind me chiming in. And look, I love
No,
to.
please, if you have any questions, if there are any gaps that I left off with, let me know, because I want people to know that they are not powerless here in the United States. We have a law. It's called Section 907.
Right.
The government is violating that law. The law requires an annual reporting. There has never been any reporting.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was in fact Joe Biden as a senator who made Section 907 a thing. And that's, it's so funny how counterintuitive it could be, because on one side, you've had in the past in the Senate what many would describe as one of our most tireless advocates, who's now, the president of the United States. But once he switches hat from legislator to executive, and now he is single-handedly, conducting the foreign policy of the United States. That's what the executive branch is really tasked with. It's so funny or sad in our case, how a tireless advocate can even play the chessboard that is international relations. And, you mentioned, taxpayer standing. Where's really our say? Where does it stop? Where does it end? So many.
I'll give you this. And I want to give a little bit of an introduction because I want the Armenian public to learn this. Okay? So
it's a nice banner you got down there. That's really
I know. I just saw that. What is that? Let's go, Brandon.
Yeah.
Look, it doesn't matter. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I just want the rule of law here. Okay? I'm not politically affiliated. I don't care. I just want these people to stand up for Armenian rights issues. These are human rights issues. We're not asking for it. We're facing an existential threat here. So for the public who don't know this, and I keep saying Section 9, I want you to know what this is. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Congress passed what's called the Freedom Support Act, which would give financial assistance to all these Soviet republics to democratize, maybe to manipulate them, whatever, who knows what their intentions were, but it was the Freedom Support Act. This had an amendment, a section called Section 907. Could you imagine back then, all these republics were getting financial aid except for Azerbaijan because of its Armenophobia. This was the law. This is in 1991. So fast forward, after 2001, George Bush and Congress at the time, they passed an amendment which basically would allow the president to waive Section 907 on a yearly basis, provided that it would give a report of how American financial assistance is being used by Azerbaijan. So my argument is that amendment in and of itself is unconstitutional because it is discriminating against Armenians. The American government knows that the state of Azerbaijan has declared all Armenians, regardless of nationality, as enemies of the state. Knowing this, how could they pass this amendment section, waiver requirement, or waiver provision for 907? The statute in and of itself is unconstitutional. And every year that it's being waived is discriminatory. And the fact that it hasn't provided any reporting is discriminatory. This is the approach that Armenians need to take. Look, we've got great grassroots organizations. We've got great individuals. We protest. We do social media. We do everything except litigate. We don't litigate. That's the only thing that goes on radar. The case that I worked for Javadyan on the New York Life case 20 years ago was reported on WikiLeaks because at the time, the foreign minister of Turkey was emailing the State Department and asking for status updates on the so-called genocide lawsuits. They don't care if Armenians protest, scream, yell, social media, whatever. Not that I'm saying that that's not important. It is important because you have to galvanize the community. You need action, right? But at the very least, what are we doing to take that to the next level? Are we suing? Are we taking steps? Are we contacting our legislatures in California saying, kick Turkey out of California? Ban Turkish Airlines out of California? What are we doing? I mean, we're screaming. I get it. It's important. But are we educating on these legal issues? And are we taking that next step? That's what we need.
And I got to jump in here because I totally agree. I think as far as executive branch advocacy, I think it's very clear. It's protests, holding accountable, meetings, what have you. You have the legislative agenda, which is, lawmaking, right? And not just lawmaking, it's policymaking specifically, but on the executive level, it's also what we call rulemaking, right? Because the federal government has to promulgate rules that, executive agencies follow. There's an administrative process that they have to follow. And there's so much that we leave because they're supposed to give us notice, meaning us being the public notice when they're making these important rulemaking decisions. And that could be from everything from agriculture to trade to commerce to really anything that would fall under the purview of generally the Congress. But if Congress has delegated that rulemaking authority to the executive branch, there's so many codes of federal regulation that would apply that, we've missed the ball on a lot of these issues. Another thing you mentioned, and I think this is so important, right? We have all these organizations and we have all these people who, have voices in the community that are trusted. And, like we got guys like Gabe, who's, a very successful comedian in his own right, MMA commentator, he's been on with Joe Rogan and, he's got his own, sort of mini community that, gets, turns to him. I mean, Gabe and I did a podcast during the war with Sam Tripoli, who, the guy is admittedly says, I'm a conspiracy theorist. Now, mind you, I'm not a traditional, I'm nowhere near a conspiracy theorist, but he invited us on. And I think that show got something like, quite a few views. Like I would say, over 100,000 views at the height of when we needed it the most. I've had appearances with, a Syrian Armenian gentleman named Gabriel Killian, who's got controversial views himself because, he's, viewed by many to be, let's say, pro-Russian or pro-Assad, anti-Western intervention or in essence, but it's an opportunity for us to go to these non-traditional places to raise our voice. But I think, Harry brought up something very important. I don't know what it is. If we have a fear to litigate, we don't have the time for it. I mean,
And we're not organized for it.
we're not, and
We don't have an Armenian version of an ADL.
exactly. And look, the Armenian Bar Association, for what they do, I've been a semi-vocal critic of the Armenian Bar Association. I certainly have a lot of people who know me there, who I'm associated with. Some of the people you mentioned today at the gala were at one point either running the organization or active in the organization. And unfortunately, I think, and I mean, Harry, practically speaking, I'm new to the profession. You've been in this community way, way longer than I have, and it's wonderful to hear your insight.
How long have you been an attorney?
I've been an attorney for, pardon my language, for a total of a fart in the wind. I've been an attorney for 2 years.
Okay.
But how long have I worked in the profession? Probably since I was 15, on and off. I started as a legal secretary and an activist and a this and a that and the other thing, to a paralegal, to a law clerk, to, finally they gave me the 6 digits that, that are the most coveted, where, I can walk into a courtroom. And what I do for a living is, I don't just defend the accused, I defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. Ultimately, I've taken the same oath that every attorney before me has and every attorney after me will, in that I am every single day walking in and protecting constitutional rights, even if it's taking a time waiver for a defendant to get the adequate time to prepare for a defense. Or in the alternative, I'm also a child dependency attorney. When they yank parents, or when they yank kids out of a parent's house, there's due process. There's all these important protections that need to be followed, because at the end of the day, those protections are there for us. Whether it's the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment. Everybody knows the First Amendment because clearly we're exercising our right to free speech. But there's so many things out there that if you don't protect, they go by the wayside. And so, listening to Harry talk about filing a lawsuit, that's one person. That's one person making a concrete change, using his or her or their expertise in order to effectuate tangible, actual change. You mentioned guys like Kim Kardashian, who went to the ICJ with erasure and their team, with Gabriel Killian, who full disclosure, he was my former boss. I've learned a lot from him. He's a great mentor. And it's not just saying, rah, rah, I'm a human rights activist, rah, rah, human rights, human rights, human rights. Everybody's a human rights activist, but what are you doing for human rights? And I think Harry hit it right on the head, is legislating. We all have a voice. I mean, we all can use it in very unique ways. I mean, Gabe could vouch for this. I've been, over the years, very active on social media, not so much as I used to be, just because of the nature and scope of what I do, but even a single tweet that I fired, I don't know, it was yesterday, just saying it was a 2-year anniversary of the war, something along the lines of, an entire nation went to sleep at peace. And the second day, 2 years ago, an entire nation went to sleep at peace. And, here we are 2 years later, and our worlds are completely turned upside down. And
I'll give you something funny about that day. Not funny, sad. On September 26th at midnight, I was watching C-SPAN, and they were debating the Justice Barrett's confirmation hearings on C-SPAN.
Right.
It was a call-in show, and I just got stuck watching it. I never watched C-SPAN. But I thought this was interesting, right? So because it was legal in nature, I wanted to see what they were saying. And they were talking about Justice Ginsburg's statement, and they were making it political. And so it was just bothering me. So I kept watching it, and I decided to call in. And you know how difficult it is to call in. So I just was calling in a million times. And oddly, my phone got answered. And I was like the last caller, right? So I said, you guys have to take the politics out of the judiciary, because you're undermining the rule of law here. Basically, that was my statement. And I said, if Justice Ginsburg, if her most, on her deathbed, apparently, her most fervent wish was that she'd be replaced until after the election. I said, she shouldn't have made that statement, and she was in the throes on her deathbed. Her family shouldn't have released that statement. Because what she basically is saying is that every single justice is a political tool. All of their opinions are basically politically based, not based on rule of law, because he or she wants to be replaced until after the election to ensure a certain demographic for the Supreme Court. I said, you have to take the politics out of the judicial system, right? And then they ended it with me, right? It was 5 o'clock in the morning, September 27th. I switched the channel to CNN, and the banner read, Nagorno-Karabakh war erupts. That's the first thing I read. I didn't sleep for 44 days after that.
Mine was incredibly similar. Actually, there was an MMA fight that night, and probably Gabe remembers who it was, but it was a big one. And I'm a casual sports guy. I mean, I'm a speaking of Canada, I'm a diehard hockey fan, so I'm always watching hockey. Born and raised in LA. I know it's weird.
Because you're young. They came to LA after '88. That's why you know.
Gretzky came to LA in '88. We had hockey in 1967. So, no, my friends used to call me Hockeypedia. I was so obsessed with it. But what I will say is this: we were out, and at that point, I'd just been an attorney for like 2 months or something like that, like
oh my
a very
gosh.
short amount of time. And I'm still trying to get my feet wet, and I'm trying to get on the conflict panel for the County Bar Association, so I can start picking up my criminal cases. Very green and excited, and I'm just entering. I'm finally going to exercise my opportunity to go to court. And the first thing that happens is I get a call from my former boss, but still my mentor, Gabriel Killian, saying, "Go home." And I said, what happened? He's like, it started. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, kid, the war started. They're attacking from all fronts. Go home. And I went home, and like you said, no sleep for 44 days, organizing protests, the freeway shutdowns, going and trying to rally people and saying, hey, make sure you don't get in trouble, giving legal advice. If someone gets arrested, you're running down to the station. And all of a sudden, I'm like, even attorneys who had no business giving advice on criminal law were just out there just to be out there to say, hey, you have a right to remain silent. Working with LAPD and working with local law enforcement in order to, not have it declared as an unlawful assembly, so all these people don't get picked up and handcuffed. It was such a crazy time. And like, you think about it, even just as first of all, your ethics as an attorney and your duty to the profession and the things you're supposed to do, all that aside, you're like, oh my God, like I'm masquerading as like this, like constitutional scholar, activist, like you name it, like you're there, like trying to throw yourself at anything that could stick. And for 44 days, like that's what an entire nation did, whether it was, going on podcasts or like trying to discuss it amongst themselves, shouting sometimes into their own echo chambers where, you have Armenian kids who have, I don't know, the same, like 40, 50 group of friends who are all on the same page, just trying to make things stick. You had people in the local media and the national media trying to shine a spotlight onto things. And, the one thing that we can't emphasize, and I think this is something that we absolutely need to talk about as far as the legal ramifications of things are concerned. And I know this is a bit of a segue, but really, we need some sort of case law that says not only was this some sort of, obviously it was a planned attack, it was an act of war, with all of these, crimes against humanity, all that stuff. But where does starting the war in the middle of a pandemic fall into that? You know what I mean? Like it's not just like, yeah, sure, there was a Spanish flu, right after World War I or sometime before, and that was just par for the course. It was a world war. But when there was,
I don't mean to cut you off, but if you're thinking of humanitarian issues relating to these people, they're
right,
genocidal. They don't care about pandemic or peace or humanity. They just want to cleanse those lands. Their intention has been to cleanse. They declared it. Erdogan said in, what was it, July 2020, we are going to accomplish the goals
right.
of our grandfathers. And
That wasn't a warning sign enough. Like, if that's not waving the flag and saying, hey, we're coming for you. And you know what? To be quite frank, I think and I blame myself for this, and I think a lot of people do these days too. I think one of the most difficult things to recognize these days is when you look at, essentially, I hate to use this term, but how complacent we were, how comfortable we were. Because we had the skirmishes in July, they're just right before that in 2020. And then, Armenia was, essentially victorious. And then all of a sudden, they're having joint war preparations. You're having Turkish jets flying into Turkey. And it's like, a part of me says, how asleep at the wheel were we as a people to not see this coming, right? And, it's always Monday morning quarterbacking, coulda, woulda, shoulda, right?
It
But
should never have happened, because let me tell you, I told you the example of '94 with Turgut Özal saying,
right,
we're going to remind Armenians of 1915. Ever since that ceasefire occurred, it horrified me, because after 94, 95, 96, that pipeline started building. And I would say to me, these people are biding their time, getting richer and richer. It's only a matter of time. Why did we allow those pipelines to be built? Why did we allow those British companies to set in, or those Western interests to set in, where they would have an incentive to be biased, right? They don't care
absolutely.
about humanity, but they're biased because they've got financial interests there now. So even back in 1995, 96, I remember a James Bond movie coming out about all these former Soviet republics, and one scene had the map of the Caucasus with this pipeline running. And I'm like, why is there the pipeline being depicted in this
Tomorrow Never Dies, or one of the Bond movies. You're right. I Now that you, and there's this part that takes place in Baku as well.
well,
And
because the lead evil villain woman was a Georgian woman. But the thing is, why would they put up a map showing a pipeline? That pipeline wasn't even a discussion as part of the movie. So they're like embedding these issues to the public, that there's a pipeline here, right? It wasn't even a topic. So I'm watching this back then going, oh my God, they're putting in the effort right now. Their media, this whole industry is putting in their efforts to create this narrative. And then you had this other prime minister, this female prime minister of Turkey, saying this, and this is an Ivy League educated minister in America saying to Armenians, we're going to teach you 1915 again. She's an Ivy League, even an Ivy League educated prime minister is genocidal. And so why are we complacent? Are we dumb? Are we lulled because the Western powers say to us, forget the past? I
and
mean, because we're just too peaceful, we like to party it up?
everybody's, what I really wish, and you brought that up, are we peaceful? Do we like to party it up? When you think Armenian, especially in LA, it's okay, party, drink, have a good time. My neighbor, my mechanic, I don't know, my plumber, my jeweler, my lawyer, my doctor is Armenian. Great. An Armenian. When you talk about things like, Israel, right? And how Israel's not just been portrayed in the media, but when I perceive Israel, right, and I'm using Israel not as a lesson, as essentially what a nation state should be with its diaspora. So when you think Israeli, you think commando, you think special forces. You have all these TV shows on Netflix that are Israeli made, and like one of them is Fauda, which is an excellent show because I think it covers so many different emotions and things like that. But it's really about protecting the nation. And a part of me is like, okay, we have all these great lawyers. Like, I know, let's say, I don't know, Setrag, the lawyer. He's a great personal injury attorney. Look, good for him. Like, let him make his money. But how many of them are, how many know him as, I know this attorney, and I know Harry Kaladjian, for instance, and here's the lawsuit he's filed. I'll be honest with you, I learned about Harry Kaladjian and the lawsuit he's filed because Gabe reached out to me saying, "Hey, you want to come on my show?" And I said, "Of course." And I Googled your name, and the first thing that came up is this lawsuit. And I'm going through and reading. I'm like, And the first thing you think is like, oh my God, like, is he one of those guys that's really just suing Biden just for the sake of suing Biden? And then you go into the merits of the case, and you just stop being like the skeptic and you go ding, 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 and your idea board sort of lights up, right? And there's this now, example, right? And it's like, when are we going to be that kind of example, right? It's not just, I know an Armenian. Like, yeah, we all know an Armenian. I live with a bunch of them in my home. I clearly know Armenians too, but what are we doing about it?
That reminds me, when you raise the issue of the Armenian Bar Association, you should know, or all of you should know, that it's not a litigation organization. But what it's not intended for. It cannot be, right? But it does provide reports, briefing, and amicus curiae briefs if necessary. I've relied on their reporting. They've done a wonderful report to Congress about the role of gray wolves. They help with whatever they can. And remember, these are all people who are volunteers. These are not paid positions. These people, and I didn't have to do the 907 lawsuit. It took away time from my whatever I do, but I did it voluntarily because it's the right thing to do. I mean, isn't it absurd that my tax dollars are being used to target me as an American of Armenian ancestry? Who puts up with that crap?
Absolutely.
Well, why aren't we all doing it? So, like I said, educate, organize, and we have to be proactive. We can't just take it. I mean, I see this willingness. I see this emotion. Look, Armenians protest for a reason, because they want their voices to be heard, right? But that's not enough. We also need to have something, a mechanism where our voices are actually heard. And that's only through courts. That's only by litigation. Javadyan said to me, enough of the crying, enough of the protesting. We need to file lawsuits. That's the only thing that they pay attention to. They don't care about us. I mean, look, these Armenian kids were going on a hunger strike during the war, and I'm thinking, what? Do you think people care for that? I mean, the only thing people care about is action. And so I decided, it's weird. April was coming in 2021 or 2022. And I had gathered all this evidence, right? I've got all these documents from ICJ, the Grey Wolves, I followed Ilham Aliyev for years on Twitter. And he would put up things like on April 24th, right? Mm-hmm. He would post things like, an important, wise decision was made on this day. Look how genocidal this lunatic is. Mm-hmm. What do Armenians do? Why aren't they following? Why aren't they reporting? So I've kept like a history of this lunatic's postings. And so I thought, God, Biden's going to waive 907 again. I was just having this internal anger of he's going to get away with it. And we're just sitting back doing nothing. And so I decided, I sat on my desk. I didn't leave. In 8 hours, I drafted the complaint and the restraining order. And the next day in the morning, I went and I filed it. And I don't know what's going to happen with it, but I just feel like I had to do something. My point is, I don't want people to feel powerless. We are not. Maybe the next thing that I will organize is creating a, nonprofit legal center for Armenian cause issues, so that we can actually litigate and galvanize. Because I think that's the only thing that's lacking with us. I mean, we do everything else except litigate.
I'm already volunteering, just but just putting that out there. And look, I just, for full disclosure, my gripe against Armenian Bar Association is that I do realize it cannot litigate. My bigger gripe is just towards the community in general, is that, you know what, we've had enough swanky networking parties. We all know each other. All the lawyers know each other. All the lawyers know each other. All their families know each other. All the kids go to school together. Let's get to work. Enough with the cocktail parties. So
I get that. It's tough. Let me just say that.
and we're look, the community is not a monolith. Great minds could disagree. Every community will have its own sort of fractures and fissures, which we all know about. We don't talk about it, but we all know about it. We're all living it in various ways. There's certain places I'm welcome, certain places I'm not. But what I will say is this: you mentioned unity, and I think that's, especially when it comes to unity around a cause, not specifically unity around a figure like a Nikol Pashinyan or like a Serge Sargsyan, what have you, or even here in the U.S. What I really, really think is that we need a cohesiveness in policy, and that Armenia's best interests and Armenian diasporan best interests should obviously
Coincide.
right, because
They
that's
should
what
coincide. Absolutely.
right, because that's how you maintain nationhood. We're not talking about nationhood in the sense like the Republic of Armenia. That's statehood. That's obviously a threat at this point. But I think what we're really missing the point on is we are at great risk right now of losing our nationhood because we cannot get over ourselves for 5 minutes to realize, this is actually happening, and it's happening on the social media front. It's happening on the global stage with, we're talking about statecraft and realpolitik. It's happening at the local level with individuals, but more importantly within our own psyche. We are on our backs. There's no other way. You mentioned we are not powerless. You're absolutely right that we're not powerless, but I think that we're too busy still kind of licking our wounds, and really what we need to do is stop the bleeding.
Number one, honestly, Joseph, as a whole, we are ignorant as a society. We have to be educated. It took one Emil Gessen to convince Armenians that ethnic cleansing was not happening.
Mm-hmm.
One foreigner who did not even know where Armenia was on a map 6 months before the war came in, infiltrated, and convinced Armenians that ethnic cleansing was not the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that.
And I don't know if you recall that particular moment where he issued like a commemorative challenge coin, which is a military thing, where on one side is Armenia, and I think the other side is Artsakh, and he said something along the lines of, they're not the same, they're separate, or one doesn't belong with the other, or very inflammatory language, which was kind of like, we were mesmerized because here's this foreigner, and we all know Lawrence of Arabia, and here comes this foreigner on his white horse with his camera telling our story. How many Armenian men and women were on the ground videotaping? And I hate to say this, I don't want to make this more political than it is, but we had filmmakers from Artsakh who documented what it was and weren't even invited to the Golden Apricot Festival in Armenia because, fill in the blanks for the agenda. But
that's the political agenda. But my point is, we're not educated in what ethnic cleansing means. This is what kills me as an international. I've studied this, right?
Right.
I studied this in 1999. I've written about it. And I had my fellow Armenians challenging me because Emil Gessen said something different.
Huh.
Think about that. Because
it's your life's work versus one guy said after,
And this guy doesn't even know what Armenia was 6 months ago. A former military commando for England, right?
Yep.
Coming in, telling us what our narrative is and convincing us to follow that narrative and asking for our money at the same time, and people willingly giving him money.
Right. This is the abuser coming home and then asking you for $20 after you've been abused, and say, you know what, but look how nice he is, and look, I'm relaying stories from my practice here, but anyways, that's a different, those are different stories for different days.
Yeah. And then he created a fake account on Instagram and started disparaging me with this fake account, saying that I had stolen money from the New York Life case. How about that? And having Armenians follow that. This is the absurdity of Armenians, where you said they see this foreigner and they just go stupid for a second and they just follow the line of whatever this guy has to say.
Harry, I'm sure you're very familiar with Stefan Partamian. He and I inadvertently coined a term for it. That Armenians, when they see non-Armenians, they have orgasms, and he likes to use words like orgasm because it's blasphemous, right?
I say another word, but it's the same. It's along the same lines.
Yeah, it's and then I said, and the word for other, odar, for foreigner, and I made a portmanteau of it and called it odargasm. So he borrowed that term for a while and ran with it. He's like odargasm, and he kept crediting me for it because he's just that guy. He doesn't like to take credit for things he has no idea about. So you have a guy like a Harry Kaladjian here who spent his life's work has been filing these lawsuits, studying international law, writing a book, writing a manual on.
Well, I haven't written a book, but I wrote a case note on the Quebec thing. But that's the issue.
And this. I mean, when I mean write a book is every time you make law, you make precedent. That's in the books. You're making law, and even advisory opinions. I mean, yeah, we know they're persuasive. They're not authoritative. Well, depending on jurisdiction, of course, but it's essentially when I don't understand something, what do I go and do? I don't go open a case and randomly start reading. I go and read a secondary source and see where all the case law is, so I could go and hunt things down. We know that as scholars, we're professionals, but it's as basic as, well, how simple is it to Google ethnic cleansing versus, because Emil Gesson said it, that's it. He's alpha and omega. We can't question anymore. And all of a sudden a source of knowledge is now your credibility is being questioned, which is absurd.
We have been struggling with this issue of ethnic cleansing since 1988.
Yep.
34 years of it. And this guy comes in and convinces a bunch of 20-year-olds who know nothing of what happened and what ethnic cleansing is. This is how absurd this community has become. It's lack of education. What else can I say? It's lack of education. And I'm grateful, Gabriel, and the reason I wanted to be here today is because I want the public to hear the words that I said, and hopefully it sticks this time, that, what is the policy? What are our rights of having self-determination? What's the law behind it? People like to throw out words like that, but no, there are reasons for why we use the words the right to self-determination. It's a legal concept. It's not just a word anybody just makes up, right? And everybody talks about territorial integrity as if that trumps the right to self-determination, as if these people should be annihilated to preserve the territorial integrity. And they don't even know what that means. What is the legal definition of an oblast under the Soviet Constitution? Why are the maps drawn this way? Does Karabakh, as an oblast, have a right to secede under the Soviet Constitution? I mean, these are legal issues people need to. I'm not even an expert at that, but that needs to be looked at, right? The United States government and the French government have always maintained, and somewhat of the Russians, that this issue is not resolved. This issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is not resolved. Because what the Russians are basically doing is saying if the OSCE Minsk group is impotent and no longer exists, that basically attacks the credibility of the French and the Americans. What's next if they agree to this? So that's that tiny little hope I've got left is the position that's taken by the French and the Americans for the OSCE Minsk group. That's the only sliver of hope that I've got. My only concern is what happens in 2.5 years when Aliyev tells Azerbaijan leave. They have that right to say it, right?
It's terrifying.
What is Russia? What are the Armenians? Winter is coming. The Azerbaijan could turn off the gas lines again and freeze these people and turn off their water or turn off their electricity, turn off their internet, all of which are elements for ethnic cleansing or an intention to ethnically cleanse. What is the international community doing about it? I want to go back to this because when Kosovo was happening with the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s, this is the absurdity. I mean, this is our fault, perhaps. There was this, like a town hall meeting featuring Christian Amanpour and President Clinton. And here she is, and the Turks were going crazy at the time because, the Muslims in Kosovo are basically the remnants of whatever Turks invaded and remained, and they wanted to support them, but they weren't able to. And Christian Amanpour was talking with Bill Clinton, and she said to him, "Why are you allowing ethnic cleansing to occur in Kosovo?" And he got so angry at the way she was handling herself. He said, "Madam," he called her madam. I don't know what he meant by that, but he called her madam. And next thing you know, the United States or NATO gets involved to prevent this horrific humanitarian disaster. And so they recognize the independence they bombed the crap out of Serbia. And then they announced their recognition of Kosovo, which, the Serbs have never recognized. And I keep saying that recognition by the United States gives us grounds to recognize Artsakh. What's the difference? What's the difference? Our conflict predates them. We have a history of genocide. Why aren't we being helped here? Does international law matter? Do humanitarian causes matter? Or is it just a political tool for people to interfere in these regions? Trump greenlighted, in my opinion, the war on Artsakh. And at the same time, he recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which doesn't even have an issue of self-determination. It was just a matter of acquiring lands by war, a concept that has supposedly ended since World War II. Why did the United States open up this door? I mean, we see what's happening now with Russia, right? Conquest through war. And then they're using the Kosovo as precedent and saying, you did it, why can't us? That they always refer to Kosovo. That was the biggest blunder after World War II. This, I don't know if it was intentional or naive on behalf of Bill Clinton, probably intentional, to bomb Belgrade, right? Yugoslavia was never part of the Warsaw.
They were never part of the USSR. They were kind of neutral, ironically.
They weren't part of the Warsaw Pact, but they were they were Soviet. They were
socialist, they were communist, but it was a very different brand of communism in that they had access to the rest of Europe. They were selling goods to both the East and the West. So it was, I studied Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia is still one of the most fascinating, studies for me to this day. And I never get tired of reading about it.
George Bush Sr., Gorbachev told George Bush Sr., don't advance NATO, we'll have full peace. And he was assured of that. Mm-hmm. But he also told the Yugoslavs, you are not going to get any financial assistance unless you disintegrate. And that started up the Croatians, the Serbs, the Bosnians, the Montenegrins. This whole war erupted, right? And then for the first time, Belgrade gets attacked by NATO, and the West recognizes Kosovo as an independent state. Putin, to this day, says, you started this with Kosovo. Why is it wrong for me to do the same? After all, these are Russians living in Ukrainian territory. in these regions, they're all Russian. They are entitled to their self-determination. The Ukrainians will annihilate them otherwise.
Right. And it's you mentioned that, and it's, and I mean, I'm sure, we can keep talking about this forever. And by the way, I hope,
But people should know this.
yeah, this is all things to know, because, and on my end, here's where it is, right? And I'm sure Harry's going to understand where I'm coming from, because when does it become about territorial integrity, and when does it become about right to self-determination? Because you have all of these world powers, plus, local interests getting into this discussion about, it's, for example, the referendums in the east of Ukraine, they want Russia wants to recognize them, and they want to join Russia and stuff like that. And we're kind of like, okay, that sounds vaguely familiar, but Russia's policy for, Artsakh is entirely different, versus you brought up Kosovo, which is, again, I love the term remedial secession, because we like to think of, I mean, first of all, you're talking about right to self-determination, which is a right is something that's posited, right? It's an affirmative thing, versus remedial, which is remedy, which is, how to make somebody whole. The question is, when, we asserted through the Soviet referendum process, through the Soviet constitution, when I say we, I mean the people of Artsakh, Armenians, asserted their right to essentially self-determination, to secede and eventually join the Republic of Armenia, or the Armenian SSR. And that was an assertive action. So it was a positive right. And I know we're going into Hegel and all these kinds of theories about, rights, whether they're positive or negative. So that's a positive right, versus what happens in Kosovo, where, courts recognize secession as a remedy, meaning that there's been so much done to these people that there's no other thing for us to do or us to order other than a remedy.
That's the beauty of that Canadian Supreme Court decision, because they basically say the same thing. They say Quebec is not entitled to remedial secession because they are not being discriminated against. What does Canada do to Quebec, to the French, that would require them to secede out of Canada? Their prime minister is French. Their language is a co-equal language. There's nothing discriminatory towards the French. Why would they don't have legal grounds to secede? This is the core issue here. Aliyev's national stamp calls for the chemical cleansing of land where Armenians live. And Formula One goes and has their race car drives or whatever races in Baku, knowing this? Is it my fault because I have not advocated this issue to F1? I mean, I feel like maybe it is our fault. Maybe we're not looking up every single event that is scheduled to take place in Baku and contacting every single sponsor of those events and saying, have you read the ICJ report here? Here it is for you. Do you want to be affiliated with this lunatic regime? I mean, Joseph, think about it. The American official website, this is what I've thrown as evidence. I said, you are telling me as an American I'm going to be discriminated against in your official publication, and you want me to pay taxes to go towards this? I mean, right. Is this how stupid we are as taxpayers, that you would tolerate this? Imagine if the country of, let's say, Germany, came up with a law saying all Jews, regardless of nationality, will be hunted down. Would America send money for that? And if there's a law that says, this is not allowed, would America, with Jews sitting around Beverly Hills, be sitting around partying it up? Every single day they would be contacting Congress saying, what is this? They would be boycotting every single item coming out of Germany. Okay? They would boycott every single event that was happening in Germany. They would boycott every single sponsor of those events. Why aren't we doing this? And we're being told, oh, just make peace, get used to it.
And what's unfortunately shocking is that, there are even those in our own community who are basically saying the same thing.
Slave mentality. We've been beaten down, and
Right. Just get used to it. Just get over it.
accept it.
Yeah. And you know, I mean, one remarkably candid remark was Shushin Umerpetk, which
Right?
is, you know, every time I hear that, you know, I picture 5,000 men and women going to a certain death, and only, you know, to pour salt on the wound. It's not even coming from the other side while the others are rejoicing. It's coming from, you know,
Joseph,
minimum.
the Turks don't even know the meaning of Nakhichevan. Nakhichevan in Armenian literally translates into the first place of descent because it's right next to Mount Ararat.
Nach Ijevan, yeah.
They are so deluded and psychotic society that they've convinced themselves that this word is a Turkish word.
Excuse me. What's worse, and I'm sorry to interrupt. What's worse is I don't even think most Armenians know what Nakhichevan means.
I didn't. Guilty.
And look, it's not. We cannot blame the average Armenian for not knowing it. It's top down, right? I mean,
the word Shushi, the city of Shushi, is documented in Armenian manuscripts in Matenadaran before the word Turk even existed. And these lunatics have the nerve to say this is our cultural capital. Isn't it enough that they've stolen?
We have more authority to call Baku our cultural capital than they have the authority to call Shushi their cultural capital. And that's the irony, is because Baku, with all of its oil wealth, with all of its architecture, with all of its everything within the Ottoman era, even through the Russian Empire, was run by us. I mean, everybody said, and very few people know this, in 1918, there were more Armenians in Baku than there were in Yerevan.
The Greeks and Armenians built Baku, right?
Say again?
The Greeks and Armenians built Baku, isn't that right?
I mean Greeks, but
I don't know about the Greeks, but I mean, I could vouch for Armenians because, like, essentially we could vouch for anything Armenian. But the reality is that in 1918, when we declared, you know, the first Armenian Republic, you know, at the 11th hour, it's either declared to be annihilated, you know, the Turkish army stops. You know, if we rested in the positions that we were in, there were more Armenians in Baku. And on top of that, what happened after that, after the Soviet, you know, or right before the Soviets, the Bolsheviks came in, you know, there was all kinds of ethnic cleansing in Baku. There was all kinds of ethnic cleansing in Shushi. So you want to talk about a genocidal maniac, as, you know, maniacs as Harry's referred to them today. There is literally so much precedent and so much history of this that, you know, it's impossible to ignore. And here we are.
Enver Pasha is glorified on the patch.
On the shoulder pad.
On the shoulder pad. Enver Pasha, who was tried in absentia in Constantinople in 1919 and was held to a sentence of death as a war criminal, is exalted as a hero for the Republic of Azerbaijan, with a saying that Armenian, if you stay, you're going to die. If you run away, you're going to die anyway. I mean, just this ridiculous. And we have Formula One having races in Baku. I mean,
and we have there's a, and for those of the viewers who don't know, and for those of them who are still tuned in at, you know, I guess over an hour in at this point, there is a victory park in Baku where essentially every Armenian is dehumanized and almost made a caricature in order for visitors to come and see. And within the entire territory of, you know, where the war occurred, there were obviously, you know, spoils of war. And you have all this Armenian machinery, tanks, equipment, you know, machines that were people died in, that were abandoned, you know, hastily, that are now being put on parade. And there's,
you know, the helmet part?
Exactly. That's what I was getting to. The very famous picture of the leader of the country, the dictator, Ilham Aliyev, walking through essentially a row. And when I mean row, it's literally a pantheon almost of these Armenian spoils that are essentially war helmets of all the Armenian dead.
Well, let me give you during the ICJ hearings. I don't know if any of you were able to watch it live. Those hearings were held online. I was watching it. Azerbaijan went and dismantled those helmets so that they wouldn't look bad to the Europeans. And then they kept their other mementos from the war. If you look up the city of Baku, you actually can find a trophy park listed on the map of Baku. This is how like genocidal and absurd the society is. It's unbelievable that we tolerate this. It's unbelievable that we look at them as this regime really needs to be toppled, and America needs to export their democracy into Baku. Because when I was still on Facebook and I was following the embassy postings for Yerevan and in Baku, every day the postings from Baku were about how great their oil industry is, their pipelines, their economy, and about that. But in Yerevan, every day they would post about how Armenians need to learn to be diverse and multicultural. Every day they did this to our, and I'm thinking, do you guys follow what you're posting to the Azeris? Why don't you teach them a little bit about multiculturalism? Armenians naturally, I hate to say it, are Odara said, I won't say it in English, but in reality, Armenians don't discriminate. No. They love, anything foreign. So, and we're being preached, it's being rammed down our throats to be multicultural. In the middle of a war, you're talking to me about how diverse America is, and while you're basically praising their economy, and even the ambassador went to Nakhichevan, right? This was the most absurd thing, putting pictures of himself in Nakhichevan, looking at Azeri areas. And I wrote to him, I said, do you even know what the word Nakhichevan means? Are you aware that 95% of the Armenian history, cultural artifacts in Nakhichevan have been erased? There are reports of this. Of course, it doesn't mean anything. It was just me ranting. But there's a report of it. We need to use it. We need to refer to it. It goes to show this genocidal policy of these people.
Right.
Like in Turkey, the genocide didn't end in 1923. It continued on with the forced name changes, city changes, desecration of monuments. It was called the Armenian Highlands. Now it's called Eastern Anatolia. We have scientific names for indigenous species such as certain, I think, wolves or foxes or whatever that carry the name Armenia in it, and they've twisted it to change it to Anatolian instead of Armenian. The scientific name for the apricot, for example.
Prunus armeniaca.
Right. But they're sold as Turkish apricots at Sprouts. Right? Is this really Turkish? Mm-hmm. I mean, so genocide doesn't just mean, the killing of the people, but genocide continues with
it's
a rewriting of history.
Yeah.
Right?
It's complete erasure of identity, rewriting of history. It's essentially burning the fingerprint of a population off of the ground and making sure that it never exists. And I'm sure, I don't know how many of the viewers will know this, but I'm sure, Harry knows this, that even the city of Ani and so many of our ruins, we were used by the Turkish military for target practice for many, many years. And we're talking churches and artifacts that, predate any concept of international law that we know of today. We have churches that are older than the Magna Carta, and they've been bombed into smithereens because the Turkish F-16s need to circle and target something.
Joseph, forget that. Well, look at the mountain behind Gabe, right? They call it Agridagi. That is Mount Ararat, right? They even rewrite the name of it. But forget that. They have taken Armenian. I mean, what kind of society does this? Please. They've taken Armenian artifacts, right? Placed it in their museums and labeled it as Seljuk. Artifacts that have been documented over 100 years ago by missionaries or historians or whatever else, and you see a picture of those in Armenian churches, and they basically show the figurine of an Armenian prince or whatnot,
Right.
and you see that same figurine, portions of it that have been possibly demolished, but portions of it are put in a museum, and they're called Seljuk. As a human being, as someone who studies history or archaeology, wouldn't you have some integrity in knowing the true facts? But this goes to show they don't even know who they are. You tell them to look. I've taken DNA testing just because out of curiosity. I'm curious to know my history, right? I say to them, take a DNA history. Figure out where you're from. Figure out your identity. This is Armenia's homeland. This is the only homeland we have. You have 9 countries that you basically took over during your migration. And this isn't enough. You want to take the last sliver of Armenia that's left to create your pan-Turkic fascist union?
Right.
Does this what Russia, Iran, and China do? Look, and the cynicism of Congress, right? Having congressional hearings about the plight of the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah.
The Uyghurs, who happen to be a Turkic group, right? They wanted to boycott the Olympics because of the Uyghurs, right? Or they did, or I don't know. No, our officials didn't go for the opening ceremony. This was our protest. So apparently, now we're all of a sudden concerned about the plight of the Uyghurs. We really care about these little Turkic ethnic groups in China, which are 20 million people of them, 30 million of them, whatever they are, causing this internal instability, the same way we cause this internal instability for Iran with the Azeri Turks. Erdogan going to Baku saying that the Araks River, unfairly divides the northern Azeris with southern Azerbaijan, basically saying, Turks in Iran, start your revolution. This is what we're seeing. This is maybe what the West wants, and maybe this is what the Zionists want. I know in Israel they're totally pushing for a revolution and violence in Iran. Maybe this is what everybody's pushing for. But guess what? 17 miles of Sunni prevents all of this from happening. So either these powers step up to the plate and show the Turks their might and their place and dissolve this Turkic union, or otherwise, if Armenia falls, they're next. They're next.
Absolutely. My grandfather, you had a very good expression. He said, which translates to the world started with us and it's going to end with us.
Well, or in Sunik. Everybody wants Sunik. Our little 17-mile width of Sunik.
We're approaching 2 hours now. I haven't even asked a single question yet. Let me throw some in there, make myself.
Yeah, Gabe, what's going on? You're just chilling over there.
You my cigarette break yet, or what?
You guys are making my job real easy here, man. I love how easy flowing the conversation has been. That's why I wanted you two on together. I figured it'd be a great conversation. All right, let me throw in a question in there. Besides the ANCA, are there any other ways we can lobby?
I'm sure Harry's going to jump in here, but it's not. Look, the ANCA is grassroots, right? And what grassroots means is it's a bottom-up type of organization, meaning each activist can do their part. Usually, it starts with rapid responder, but the ANCA is effective in Glendale, let's say, where they're effective nationally, of course, but they're effective in Glendale when you have 300,000, 400,000 people in LA County who are of Armenian origin, but you have people who live out in Arkansas, Alabama. I remember, especially when I was at the ANCA, and we were doing our own little internal research on, where we can, find people and, activate them, essentially, have them go into their congressional offices and stuff like that. And you have people like, we have a amazingly amazing community in Richmond, Virginia, that I had no idea about until I was out in DC. And at the time, the head of the local Richmond Democratic Party and the Richmond Republican Party were brother and sister. Yeah, they were siblings. One was the head of the Democrats, the other one was the head of the Republicans, or were very much activists. And everybody who had to run for office in Virginia had to go through them at some point. But you're talking about two people in a state like Virginia, which Virginia could switch at the flip of a hat. It's a perennial swing state. So there's a lot of money, a lot of targeted ads going to Virginia, and a lot of politicians who are trying to, a lot of times, they say those who control Virginia kind of control the country, or like, the party that controls Virginia will end up determine who will win the election. And you're talking about two people, right? You're talking about places in, especially recent people who are coming in from Armenia, who are, here on scholarships and who are, getting these grants to come study here. And all of a sudden, they discover that they could go up to their congressional office, knock on the door, and ask for a meeting with their representative, with their state assemblyman, with their state senator. And it's, there's this concept of wholesale that we've been talking about, where you're like, we need to do this and we need to do that and we need to do the other thing. I can't even count how many times, like, an activist in Hawaii, an Armenian guy who was there doing his PhD or something like that at the University of Hawaii, managed to befriend someone who works for Senator so-and-so. And next thing you know, we have an Armenian genocide resolution that passes in Hawaii, or we have the Republic of Artsakh being recognized in Hawaii. And this is on the work of literally one or two people with, of course, the resources of the ANCA, of your lobbying or your activist groups. You have people who are, doing, they have their micro blogs, or they have blogs, or they have channels where they discuss certain things that have little pockets of their own influence. And they'll say, write your congressman, write your senator. There's one thing that we've forgotten, and this is very important as Americans that we need to understand. You are the power. You are absolutely, it's not just power to the people that we preach. The most important entity in a democracy is the citizen. It's not the government, because the government is made, as it says, by the people, for the people. So no one should, and Harry alluded to this several times, no one should feel powerless, but especially when you're on your own home turf, when this is your constituency. It's no surprise that Glendale has 4 out of 5 of their city council people who are Armenian, and that didn't come overnight. It's because we know that this is our home base. This is, we can do things a certain way over here. But we can also go up to Sacramento, and everybody knows, look, the Armenians in Southern California kind of run the show, so we better comply. And the same applies at the national level. The other thing is, everybody who's a local politician at some point will weed out and become a national figure at some point. They will reach the national stage. We've had people who started off in local politics, in city council, that have gone on to the state senate, that have gone on to Congress, that will eventually go on to either run for office, run for a federal judge or something like that, or, be nominated as a federal judge. And that type of influence to have, this kid helped me out on my campaign. And, I remember what he taught me about being Armenian, or how difficult it is, or the plight of the Armenians, and so on and so forth. And if you want to talk about being overrepresented in the community, I mean, Harry and I can vouch for this. There's so many damn Armenian lawyers. We're just like everywhere. You walk into a courthouse or a courtroom, and if you want to talk about disproportionate representation and how policy is made, believe me, you walk into Department 30 at CCB downtown right now, you have an Armenian public defender, you have an Armenian district attorney, you have, when I'm in there, you have an Armenian private defense attorney, you have at times Armenian judges who are covering the bench, and every single time we have an opportunity, we will bring up the fact that we're Armenian. And a lot of people who go through those halls as district attorneys eventually run for public office. They know where the power lies. So it's the power that we have as individuals, as citizens, based on how we exercise our constitutional rights, is absolutely important. But the power we have to speak up about Armenians, Armenian causes, Armenian issues, like everybody in my office right now knows that, we're at war again. and they could read it off my face. So they not only say, well, what's going on? Can you explain Armenia to me? It's now a conversation of, hey, how you doing? Like, can you give us an update? How can we help? And that makes a world of difference. So as far as being an influencer, if you will, we're all influencers in our own right. It's our opportunity to find the opportunity to not only, hold feet to the fire, but when things get quiet and when we are essentially complacent, when things are going well, it's not to take your foot off the gas. It's to say, you know what, they'll say, get over it. I'm never going to get over it.
Joseph, it took one friend of mine in the state of Nevada to put genocide education as a curriculum in the whole of Nevada.
That's one person.
It took one person to do this.
It's remarkable because sometimes that's all it takes. And what do we look for as most of your run-of-the-mill activist, Gabe, your run-of-the-mill Armenian activist is not waiting to be applauded for all the wonderful work they do. I mean, literally, sometimes it's just rolling up your sleeves and saying, how can I help or what can I do? And going and doing it.
Doing it every day.
Every single day.
Not when a tragedy hits us. Not when an event or gala happens. Look, the ANCA needs funding. It needs money. Donate. Be a rapid responder to it. I keep talking about ANCA. There's also, Gabe, you mentioned your question, what can we do? There's also the Armenian Assembly.
Right.
And like Joseph said, that ANCA is grassroots. Armenian Assembly gives the impression that it's the reverse. It has big donors and works from up to down.
Right.
I've actually advocated with them when we had Zoom advocacy meetings with congressional leaders. And
right.
one
of the guys who's very active with the Armenian Assembly. There's plenty of people, and look, we've worn hats for different organizations too. So every organization is out there doing their best. But I think, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Harry. So the perception has been in the past that the Armenian Assembly works more closely with the State Department.
Right? It does. That's where I was going to.
Top down kind of understanding. Whereas the ANCA is regular guys. I mean, forgive me, guys sitting at the Agumpa on the weekends and their kids who know how to speak English going knocking on the doors. To be a little crude, obviously it's way more complex than that. It's way more involved. But the spirit of what's being done, one is really on a high level policy, top down kind of approach. Whereas grassroots is literally, this is our power as the community, which gives our advocates in DC and everywhere else a voice that we can push through.
I'll tell you one thing that has bothered me for quite a bit, and without criticizing Armenian Assembly, there was a WikiLeaks email from Hillary Clinton from like 17 years ago. And in it, she says, we need to cultivate or reach out to prominent Armenians and get them to basically start this new narrative amongst Armenian circles. And I've always thought about, well, which Armenians did they reach out to? And what is the agenda for this? Because, the US Embassy posted that they are now issuing a $400,000 grant to basically target the youth, Armenian youth, to start thinking differently about Turkey. So I'm curious to know what this agenda is. I mean, I don't hear them telling Baku that we're going to teach you to accept Armenians. But now they have a new program where basically they're going to pay somebody $400,000 to start up a plan to teach the youth how nice Turkey is. So I've always been curious, who did Hillary back then reach out to? Who did she tap? Who did she recruit? And you have to look at, the conversations that come out of these groups and question, where is this coming from? So, like I said, I'm not a member of any political group. I question everything. It's just in my nature. And so when somebody says something to you, don't just ignore it. Pay attention to the words that are being used.
Why are there no Armenians in the U.S. Congress or Senate? And,
False.
there are?
I just told you, Jackie Spear, right? She's half Armenian, and Ana Eshu.
Anna Eshu is also half Armenian. So we do have Armenians in Congress. Yeah.
Who else is there? Is that
Representing the Bay Area, I believe. So the Bay Area is heavily Armenian represented.
So when Nancy Pelosi went on her trip to Armenia, along with her came Jackie Spear, Ana Eshu, and Frank Pallone. Of course, Frank Pallone represents the New Jersey area.
But he's practically Armenian, and he's great.
He's a very great guy. He actually said, I don't understand how Pashinyan gave up Karvajar. This came out from Frank Pallone, okay? So, but that aside, Jackie Spear, unfortunately, is retiring. And so we're losing that one representation that we have.
He's lived a very fascinating life. Of course we could get into this, but she's lived through some pretty insane things. She was a survivor of the Johnstown massacre.
Right. She was shot.
She was shot. She played dead, and and her boss was, a congressman at the time who went on there on a fact-finding mission, and she ended up running for her old boss's seat. So she has lived a very remarkable life. And I met her several times, and I remember the first time I met her, it was during a California Democratic Party event, and I was probably 16 years old at the time, or 17. And, I was very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and very excited about politics. I was very anti-war, even though I didn't understand the ramifications of it. I just thought, my favorite bands are singing about it. And, George Bush is bad and all this stuff. So I got enthralled in it. And when I met her, she came up to me and said, "Son, what's your name?" And then I had my little ANCA badge. And the current mayor of Glendale, Artie Kasakian, could vouch for this because he was there at the time. And he took me over to introduce her and said, "What's your name?" And then when she saw ANCA, and she goes, "Did you know I'm Armenian?" And then talked about how, she grew up Armenian, and, all the wonderful stuff that Harry said about her is absolutely true, but one of the most humble individuals you will meet. She is one of the most influential people on the Hill, even though she's very quiet and very dignified as to how she goes about what she does. And yeah, it's unfortunate that, she's had a long and illustrious career as a stateswoman, and, she deserves all the credit in the world for that. But, it's sad to see her go. And Ana Eshu is actually, she's Armenian, and she's half Armenian, half Assyrian, and you're talking about the two most picked on communities in the Middle East, if you think about it, really. So, we are represented in Congress, and even on the state level. I mean, we've had, here in California, we've had governors, we've got speakers of the House, obviously state assemblymen and women. We're almost, again, disproportionately represented sometimes, and I couldn't be happier about that.
So, Gabe, when are you running for Congress?
Yeah, man, let's do this.
I mean, seriously, each of us have to think. I've been thinking about it. That's one of my options. I thought, where I live, I wasn't too happy with the representation, because I was basically contacting my representative on a weekly basis, maybe a daily basis at times, and he wouldn't respond to me, and he eventually did 3-4 months later, or his assistant did. And I thought, the violence that Armenians faced wasn't only in Artsakh or Armenia.
Right.
The church and school in San Francisco got firebombed right before the September 2020 war. Was that resolved, with Azerbaijani flags or whatever spray painted all over the place? Who funded it? How did these terrorists come to the United States? Were they flown in by Turkish Airlines? So we're facing terrorism not just in Armenia or Armenophobia in Armenia, it's worldwide. The Armenians in Europe, Armenians in Paris were in hiding when the group of Turks were walking down the streets calling for the hunting of Armenians. I mean, imagine.
And this is a horror we still live. And look, a lot of people have lived horrors like this in their history. The Jews during the Kristallnacht, and I mean, even in our own history, we had our own Black Sunday, which was commemorated as April 24th, and it's a terrible. I mean, the pogroms in Baku. It was during the war. It was not safe to be an Armenian in Moscow.
Well, it's not even safe to be Armenian here in California, though.
Absolutely.
What are we doing about it?
And I was eyewitness to the brawl that went down during when the July skirmishes were happening, when we had gone to protest in front of the Azeri consulate, and I clearly saw who instigated it. And of course, disproportionate numbers, us being numerous here, I'm sure the consequences at some were felt a few months later, seeing that that I'm sure that those images were played on Azeri and Turkish networks on a loop, because again, when you're talking about a state policy of essentially ethnic cleansing, genocide, Armenophobia, the ramifications of that, it would grow exponentially, and it's a terrifying thing to feel. It's ironic. I've always said the two safest places I feel are in Yerevan, Armenia, which even these days is a question is whether you can feel safe there with the Azeris now on Armenian soil, and the other place I feel the safest is right here in Hollywood, California, Little Armenia, because that's where I met Gabe, and he knows this. We know everybody up and down the block. We know everybody in every house. We went to school with them. We know their grandparents and this and that. And ain't nobody going to show up and try to do anything in our neighborhood. That's why, there's very few places I would feel safe, realistically. Yeah, it's a crazy time to be alive, and it's a crazier time to be Armenian.
So I guess the issue is, yes, Gabriel, we need representation. It's kind of shameful that with 1 million Armenians, we don't have more. But we need to be, at least if you're not running for office, just get to know your representative and make it known that you're interested in issues that affect the community. Contact constantly, invite them to your church events. The church has a political dimension to it, because the government basically looks at the church leaders as representatives of the community. So invite them, be more proactive in your parish council, be a member of your parish council, have events, invite and engage your representatives, call them, because I'm told that calling gets their attention more than just sending an email or a tweet or whatever. Just call them. And you could find their information online. The U.S. Congress House of Representatives website, I think if you put your zip code, it'll give you a list of all your representatives. You could do that. I mean, right after the war, I think it was the mayor of Irvine or some city had proclaimed Azerbaijan Day.
Yep.
And I contacted the mayor and got a response back that they were retracting it.
Just 2 weeks ago.
How in the world does that happen in Southern California?
Right. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, Nasimi Aghayev, who was, the consul general of Azerbaijan, posted this declaration that he'd allegedly received from the Board of Supervisors. And one by one, all it took was one tweet from a well-known activist, a local activist, one of our ANCA activists, to basically say, hey, Catherine Barger, what's going on? And one by one, each one of those, supervisors who had allegedly signed on retracted their signatures, because it's an automated process, right? A lot of people don't know this. Like, these supervisors are not actually sitting there and signing these proclamations. Someone makes a request. So long as it's not obscene, it looks like it's coming from someone important, like a consul general. they just hit print on a printer and boom, there it is.
But how does it happen where we can't take a step before this even takes place?
Right, because this is it's such a city process. Like it's basically probably done within the county. It's such an automatic process because think about it. If these elected officials who are running Los Angeles County, which is the most populous county in California, if not the entire United States, are so busy doing their day-to-day jobs, they're not going to sit there and sign proclamations. But there's someone at the staff level who will probably approve it that's been delegated that was brought to their attention. And obviously, with the
Is it our failure that we are not reaching out to the staff level, to all those employees, sending out circulars saying that this is an Armenophobic, genocidal, lunatic state? Is it our fault that in our backyard this is happening? I mean, I'm not talking about Oklahoma, where that crazy governor goes off to Baku and gives Aliyev a cowboy hat, right? I'm talking about Southern California here. How does this happen where we're not engaging with these people?
Well, what I can tell you, Harry, what I can tell you is when I was at the ANCA, we had, and they still have it to a certain extent, but we had what were known as advocacy days, right? And so what we would do is we'd pack these buses full of, everybody from the high school level up through, elders and everybody in between, business owners, and kind of take them up to Sacramento so they can meet their representatives, but also advocate Armenian issues, but also give them an explanation of how, the halls of the state legislature work. Because at that point, everybody has a concept of the president, but they don't realize how much state law they're actually subject to. And you and I know this, you're subject to more state laws, especially in California, than you are to federal laws. I mean, you're subject to both, obviously, but the remarkable understanding of, hey, we're here not only commemorating the Armenian genocide per se, but hey, here's this resolution that we are introducing to promote U.S.-Armenia trade. Here's this resolution that we're promoting to support, recognition of the Republic of Artsakh, or here's this resolution that we're pushing to open up an Armenia-U.S. trade office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, the big policy thing in the past was obviously Armenian genocide recognition. But when you're talking grassroots level and tangible policy, it's happening every day. And it's as little as, securing some sort of funding for a kindergarten somewhere, out in Martuni, for instance, or, donating books or donating computers, sister city projects. There's so many different ways that these things could be done, and politicians eat them up because what do they love? They love photo opportunities to be able to say, look, we're doing something for you. But the people who ironically love photo opportunities more, are the constituents, and especially Armenian constituents, who will line up in order, which is something I tend to tease. It's like, who's going to stand closest to the person and said, I did it, or like, I was here, and then brag about it. But I think what gets lost in the process is also understanding that, look, this is your power, and it's through these initiatives that we can, push our collective message, our collective flag forward.
I think that's the odargasm you were talking about.
Odargasm, exactly. And I'm going to send this once we're done with the clip. I'm going to send it to Stepan. I hope he has enough 2 hours 20 minutes at this point to listen to a bunch of attorneys talk. He hears us talk all the time. So but yeah.
All right, I'm gonna jump to my next question. How much influence does Aliyev have over the world government?
The world government. Well, it was interesting.
Europe, all over,
Look, money talks, right?
Mm-hmm.
We just have to take steps to prevent the influence of that. We can't be complacent and sit back. I mentioned Formula One. I mentioned the sponsors, concerts, Eurovision, whatever. Everything counts. We have to target every single source of income for Aliyev.
Well, that brings me to my next question. There are politicians all over the world on Aliyev's payroll who are acting against the best interest of Armenians. What are the steps that should be taken to remove these corrupt politicians from said payroll?
Exposure. Look, you cannot convince somebody not to take money. You have to expose them. Their conduct has to be exposed. And let me tell you the level of. There was this lady on a Baku. I was following a Telegram channel, a Baku, an Azerbaijani channel. You have to listen to what they're thinking, right? You can't just listen to what Armenians are saying. You have to listen to what they say. So this woman from the United States basically said, not only did we win the military war, but we won the social media war, she said. And that's how we convinced all these Western governments to be on our side. And I kept thinking, this policy of this war didn't just happen overnight. This was planned out in years in advance. It was multifaceted. It included a psychological internet media aspect to it where even the Israelis got involved. I don't know how many of you watch Jeopardy, but I remember in the 80s when this whole Artsakh movement first started, Jeopardy questions would reflect accurately about the right of self-determination for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. But during the war, there was a Jeopardy question that painted Armenians in a negative light, or Armenia. Not just the Armenians, but Armenia itself in a negative light. And I was curious, which writer came up with this question? Who directed this writer to draft this question this way? Where does this come from? I put a picture of the Shushi Cathedral with the hole in its roof on Facebook, and I got banned 30 days from Facebook.
Wow.
Where does this come from? This was a targeted attack by Azeri agents and their friends who hold important positions of power in these organizations. The American media didn't cover anything for 44 days. That's why people were protesting in front of CNN. So where does this influence come from? What did Azerbaijan or Aliyev buy? Did he just buy Israeli weapons, or what sort of influence did that get him with the Israelis and their agents? These are important issues we need to look at. We can't just forget it, because it'll happen again. We have to hold everyone accountable. Armenians love to party and move on and look for the next day, but it's not acceptable for me. It's some things that I can't let go. It doesn't make sense. Certain things don't make sense for me. And that's why I think everybody should look into it. How many people contacted Jeopardy and say, why did you put a question that paints Armenia in a negative light or falsifies history? Why would you do this? If you want to know history, look at your own question from 30 years before. We have to engage and advocate and lobby and be persistent and unrelenting.
Joe, do you have anything else to bring up before we wrap up?
I think it's it. Look, I think, we can sit here and pontificate as much as we want, but at the end of the day, and, I can certainly speak for myself. I think one of the most important things is taking action. It's not being complacent. Complacency kills. It's a well-known expression. We can't sit on our laurels. We can't rest. I'm not as active as I used to be on social media. I still tweet. You can follow me at SlowMoJoe. That's SLOMOJOE on Twitter. Of course, being a professional these days, I can't be as candid as I would usually like to be. But I shoot from the hip a lot of times, and sometimes I have some hot takes. And what I encourage is look at the posts that I have with the most comments that are praising Armenia or discussing the war, and go look at the comment sections, and you will see that there's so many Turkish and Azeri trolls that try to take over the post. But what all that does is amplifies my voice, and I'm happy about it. And we need to amplify other Armenian voices. Gabe, this is your first foray into, well, not your first foray, but you've started this podcast, which I think is remarkable, and it's called The American Armenian. And we have this dual identity. We are 100% American and 100% Armenian. And a lot of people don't understand that, but a lot of diaspora communities certainly can relate. So I think what's really important for us is to continue to support one another. And, and I want to thank you, Gabe, for, getting me in touch with Harry, so that, I'm sure, and I'm always willing to help out however I can, to be able to collaborate and to, take direction from someone who didn't have someone, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, who probably didn't have somebody giving him direction, and he kind of figured things out on his own. Luckily, I'm blessed because, I've had the mentors that I've had. I've had people steer me, unfortunately steer me into some sort of a public figure or public persona type of, and given me a platform and helped me develop my own. But, there's so many people out there that have great ideas that are shut down because, there are bigger voices and louder voices in the room that just want to shout over one another. Someone might be an influencer and, has billions of followers, but they're just leading, they're leading their followers down the wrong path. Whereas you have people, who have dedicated their life's work that are, being silenced because there's nobody out there listening to them. So look, I'm grateful, Gabe, for you bringing us on so that we can, hopefully amplify our own voices, and, hopefully you can help others amplify theirs. And, maybe we could rethink the wheel, and, we don't need to reinvent it, but, we need to go back to square one and kind of figure ourselves out a little bit. And so thanks for that.
Thanks for coming on, brother.
At the very least, I encourage everybody as a start to be a rapid responder for ANCA. Check out what they do and learn from their rapid response messages, and just engage and educate yourself. Don't just let things pass without figuring out whys. You have to question everything. I too am grateful, Gabriel, for this opportunity. This almost didn't happen today, but it did, and I'm grateful for that. Hopefully, if we could get one person to learn something, that one person could make that change, just like that one friend of mine in Nevada was able to get the Genocide Education Act passed in Nevada. Years ago, I gave an April 24th speech at our local parish church. There were people from the Tolerance Center who were there, and then they invited me to talk about the Armenian genocide. And so for every year since then, I teach the local youth in my county about the Armenian genocide. And these are not just Armenians. They're not Armenians. It's the public school system, the school district where I live. So it's not just us, but everybody else. And the way I start my lecture is, do you know what April 24th is? And to Armenians, I ask, why April 24th and not April 23 or April 22 or April 21? Do we as Armenians understand why it was that April 24th was the date? And that's, sadly, some things that Armenians can't even answer. And so we need to be educated. And so it starts with our education and then our advocacy. We have to talk in a common voice with a common agenda, stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm with this common voice. Otherwise, these foreign groups are going to infiltrate and divide us. And, we like all things foreign, so it's easy to do that with us.
Well, I want to thank Harry and Joseph for joining me today, and thank everybody else for tuning in.
And great meeting you, Joseph.
Pleasure's all mine.
Stay beautiful. God bless Armenia.
Bye.
So I am an American Armenian, representing both nations in the media. And can you hear the sound of hysteria? The subliminal mind-blown America. Alright! Welcome to a new kind of tension all across the alien nations. Everything isn't meant to be okay. Television dreams of tomorrow. We're not the ones who meant to follow. For all that's enough to argue.